Am revenit în direct. Care sunt previziunile economice pentru România în acest an? De unde vor veni problemele? Ce se va întâmpla cu toată regiunea Europei de Est dacă Rusia atacă Ucraina? Mergem acum la Londra, la Raffaella TENCONI, economistul-șef al UD este cel mai mare sau printre cei mai mari broker din Europa Centrală și de Est. Raffaella, how are you?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm very well. How are you?
Very well. How is London doing?
It's good. It's coming back, slowly but surely.
Yeah. Raffaella, you follow Romania economy and political since when?
I think
more than 10 years.
Yeah, multiple decades, unfortunately, which
decades.
reveals my age.
Right now, how you see Romanian in this year? And for us, 2021 was a good year. I think the economic growth will be 7%. Okay. Yes, we have some deficit, budgetary deficit, current account deficit, commercial deficit, but we are in the market.
Yes,
right.
I think it was always the case that you always have some deficits, but the economy is good. I mean, we forecast GDP growth this year 4.5%.
Okay.
So not as good as last year.
Okay.
We are very conservative. I tend to be much more concerned about the outlook for global growth than most people in the street. So I have all of my forecasts relatively low compared with consensus, but I think the data that we see so far, so we have up to January in bits and pieces, show that the industrial sector is coming back. In European terms, it's definitely surprising, and that is
in the positive way or negative?
In positive way.
Positive way.
No, in positive way. In positive way. There is actual order improvement in January. Of course, there is a little bit of a problem with the epidemic. So services, retail not doing as well as they were doing a couple of months ago, but the trend is up. And construction, as you know, is doing very well. So I think this is going to be a good year for GDP. But of course, we have to clarify a little bit what does that mean for purchasing power of people, because that's a different story.
Okay, in purchasing power of people, we have nominal salary, nominal income, minus inflation, and inflation is very high, so the purchasing power maybe will be done.
Yeah, it's not as good as it was in the last few years. In Romania in particular, you had many years of very strong purchasing power increases. This year is not going to be great. It may not be terrible. There are other places in much worse position, frankly, so relative to other countries, you're still doing very well. But of course, we have inflation, we have high energy prices, and I am in particularly one of those economists that think that inflation is here to stay for a long period of time. So this is a change of pace relative to the last years.
When you say the inflation will be here with us in bed, how many years?
A decade.
Decade. But when you see inflation, you compare what was in the last decade when we was 0, 1, even in Romania, and we have 2 years in deflation period, we were. When you see inflation in the next 10 years, what kind of inflation?
Okay.
It's between
I think in the case of Romania, you're talking maybe average inflation 3.5%. So not very far from where is the target of the central bank, but a little bit up certainly up relative to the deflation years. But it's relevant for you to understand that globally, both in the US and in Europe in general, average inflation will be meaningfully higher than in the past, not just because of the temporary deflation story, but because digitalization, which is the biggest trend in town, the biggest change we're doing now, and we're going to do it for the many decades
So digitalization will come with the inflation?
Yes. With
In
inflation.
what way? This is a strange topic or declaration. How comes?
Yes.
Because all the people said digitalization will be very good for the world, for the countries, for the companies, for the people.
Well, there was a time in the, the internet wasn't invented this year, it has been around now for 25 years in commercial terms. And I think the first decades, indeed, it brought less inflation because of quality improvement, because a lot of competition. But where we are now, we are in a place where digitalization, together with other factors, increases oligopolistic power. Enormous companies in absolute amount relative to even GDP of countries, and they have the pricing power of oligopolies. So they price as such.
Okay,
and I think
I
this
understand
is a big
that Amazon, Google, Facebook, they are monopolistic. But do you see this situation in the other sectors?
In
the
other
same
sectors,
situation?
yes, because what we're doing smart pricing everywhere. We're deploying artificial intelligence in general as a business tool. So the way companies will price, at least the ones that are very large, is increasingly going to be trying to extract as much from demand rather than pricing on the basis of cost. And the other thing that you have to remember is that, first of all, digitalization is energy intensive. And we're also doing green economy at the same time. So you have a genuine cost push through energy. You have a cost push because digitalization is based on networks. Even if, let's say you sell furniture, okay? You sell furniture.
Yeah.
But now you have to sell it online as well as in presence. And in order to sell it online, you need to be visible to your audience. And to be visible to your audience, you need to be in the top 10 results. So you have to buy advertising. So your sector may not be oligopolistic, and structurally it's very hard to be oligopolistic, but some of your costs, which become necessary to be successful, will be based on oligopolistic pricing. So your cost structure also is going to go up more than before, purely because of that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. If you see the average inflation in Romania in the next decade, 3.5 or up, what will be in the nominal figures in Europe and the United States?
In Europe, we think, well, Europe in the past decade was slightly less than 2%.
Yes, it's under the target.
Under the target, exactly. In the Eurozone, I think it could be on average 2.5%, maybe 2.8. So actually a percentage point above what it was in the past decade. And in the US, I think you will see something similar. So it's not runaway inflation, but it's a change of the trajectory, which is very long term. And also it has consequences for purchasing power of people, because on top of having higher inflation, digitalization facilitates a divergence in wages of people across the income distribution. Let's say it more clearly. If you have elementary school or secondary school education, or in a job that requires that kind of position is likely to face less favorable wage dynamic.
Okay.
Okay. But if you have at least university degree or more, your skills are more likely to be more in demand, and therefore your wage trajectory is going to be more favorable than before.
So, the people who have a higher education, their income will be up, and the people who will not have, the income will stay stable or less. This is your projection.
Exactly.
Okay.
So where is the problem?
Yeah, in this
problem is in Europe, the majority of people don't have university degrees.
Is the same situation in United States?
No.
No?
No, 60% of people have university degrees. We can debate on the quality, but in reality, the labor force is favorable. The structure is more favorable in the US.
Okay, so in Europe, how many people have higher education and higher skill?
On average, 40%.
40%.
40.
Okay,
Yeah.
40% and 60% will be
Worse off.
hit.
Yeah.
But what will happen? So in this case, the populism will be up. So the people will be very angry, not hungry, and angry
Hungry
and
as well.
hungry, the same, okay, and they will be in the street.
Yes, which is why I mean, we're simplifying, of course, but the
Yes.
essence is correct. Which is why in Europe, I think one of the biggest changes that we're observing now is that the fiscal restraint that was so important in the first 20 years of the euro is going to be significantly watered down. Part of it is exactly because of this principle. It becomes politically unviable to live this kind of transition without fiscal transfers.
Okay, so in this case, the taxes will be up. If the politician and the government wants to calm down the people, so they need to increase the taxes.
I think we have discovered quantitative easing, so the
Yeah, in
deficit
this
will
case,
be
yeah.
up.
Okay, but I think quantitative easing will not last forever.
I think you're
You
wrong.
never know. You never know, of course. But in the end, the government will have to do something.
Yes. Okay. So let's try to clarify a little bit here. First of all, quantitative easing. Since we're talking about a decade, so let's say until 2030. I think until 2030, quantitative easing will stay with us on and off. So, for example, the Americans have stopped it now, but they could be restarting it already before the end of 2023. And something similar can happen in the Eurozone. We can stop it at some point in the next 12 months and restart it quite quickly. This is different from what we had in previous decades. So in terms of financing, you can live with larger deficits for longer than before.
This is the dream of Italy or Spain or Greece to have a large deficit, even the Romanian.
Yes, well, I think it's everybody's dream. I think the French and the Germans enjoy it.
Yeah, in the same
much.
same situation. Okay,
Yes.
in the case of Romania, how you see the most challenges this year will be for Romanian, and how we can handle this current account deficit, budgetary deficit, and commercial deficit, and in the meantime to have a stable currency.
Well, okay. Our fair value models for RON suggest that there is a mild depreciation bias. Not very large, but 5 against the euro, going to 5.1, 5.2 into next year, I think is very reasonable and very plausible.
It's very reasonable.
It's very reasonable.
Yeah,
I think
the people
if you
think 6 lei for €1 if will be a war.
No,
No,
I think they're wrong. They're wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, you do have quantitative easing in the background in the Eurozone, and although it is not active in Romania, it does create a favorable global backdrop. So that in itself is a shield. Second of all, we do have the recovery fund, as you know.
Yeah.
Romania is a very big recipient. And the recovery fund, it's a trick and a treat in the sense that it does have conditionality. It's not as strict as an IMF program, of course,
yes.
but there is conditionality and there is monitoring. And it does apply even to Italy. So in that respect, it's the only real monitoring that I think is going to be with us in Europe for the next few years.
I think decades.
I'm
not
not
the
sure
next
about
year.
decades.
Will be.
But I think, let's say in the next 3 years, the next
Okay.
3 years, which for Romania are particularly tricky because you do have a budget deficit that needs to do a little bit of consolidation. Not too much, but a little bit. To answer your question, how do you navigate the funding deficits that you have? I think you navigate it because the European Commission imposes some restraint. You know, you cannot increase pensions by 40%.
Yes.
You can pay some compensation to energy, but not as much as you'd probably want. You cannot increase public sector wages 15% anymore. You can by 7%. So you have to find a prudent way out, which I think is completely reasonable, given that Romania does have still a very competitive economy. It has convergence towards European wages. It's still a very powerful trend. So to you, even though digitalization does affect the majority of people, it's not as hard to navigate from a policy-making perspective as it is for Italians, for example, or Greeks, something like that.
So we have more space in the room to walk and to have a favorable condition to increase.
Yes, because there are a lot of things that you do well and you can do more of those. And the labor force is still very, very cheap relative to the EU. So you have a lot of companies that would rather relocate to Romania than relocate elsewhere or restructure. So I think this is incredibly helpful.
Okay, how you see the inflation this year?
On average,
if you have some indicators, macroeconomic indicators for this year. So the economic growth, it's 4.5. Okay.
Yeah.
The inflation.
It's 7%.
7%. Okay.
Yes. And the policy rate will rise to 4.5%.
4.5%.
Yes.
The governor will be very angry for you. 4.5%.
Inflation is 7%.
Yeah, we don't have enough meeting this year to increase the interest rates to 4.5%.
Admittedly, this may be a little bit aggressive. Maybe you get there next year, okay? But I think the point is there is an increase in interest rates everywhere.
Yeah.
And the timing and the magnitude really critically depend, I think, on two big issues. One is the Federal Reserve. Is the Federal Reserve navigating this in a reasonable way, which means interest rates rise this year and the next year, and then we are heading into global recession towards the end of 2023? Or is it going to be a bit like the Czech central bank? It's front-loading its activity, which means you'll be in global recession already at the beginning of next year. Or something, if it's a massive global slowdown, put it that way.
Okay, so and Ron, if the interest rate for the National Bank will be 4.5, okay, how you see the RON?
We have RON at 5.1 against the euro this year and 5.2 next year.
Okay, 5.2 next year, okay.
Yes.
It's a higher interest rate.
It's a higher interest rate, but by the way, so let me tell you a little bit how we do. We have fair value models for RON, for the 10-year yield in RON, and for the stock market index.
Okay.
And we compute these models using these assumptions plus others that we simply have. So the top-down view. And the top-down view shows that provided we are not in the bad scenario for the Fed, okay? It's not the Fed that is really fast forwarding too much. And provided we don't have war with Russia,
okay,
then I think the stock market in Romania is one that is looking most compelling in Europe because it still has a lot of upside.
Okay, and if you talk about upside, last year the stock market index increased to 36%. Okay, this year, what is your prediction?
On a fair value basis, you could easily see another 20%.
20%.
Provided we don't see that big global scenario. And the reason why it's doing that is because the model signals that the economy is fundamentally healthy. Okay. It's adjusting to slightly less euphoria, but it's still fundamentally very healthy, and it was a nice convergence path.
Okay, so Romanian economy is still very healthy.
Yes.
Okay, and in the term of budgetary deficit, account deficit, don't you see any problem this year?
Not really, because yes, they're both large, but we do live in a world where everybody has large budget deficits. Current account deficits, not so much, but Romania is relatively small, and again, with QE in the Eurozone still going, and FDI is still coming in, and you also have the pension funds in Romania, which are big buyers of local debt.
Right now is the biggest buyer.
Exactly, and so that gives a certain stability to the economy that it's quite rare lately. Now, I think you could play around with a couple of scenarios. The first one is if Europe, if we have a serious invasion in Ukraine, Europe then becomes in a very difficult position because it will have energy prices increasing. It's very hard to navigate the situation to keep it stable with an invasion. So you risk that momentum in the industrial sector that I was speaking about earlier, all of a sudden stalls, and you have high inflation, slower growth, and then no quick solution. So then that, of course, that will hurt the Romanian recovery just like it will hurt the European recovery.
If we have a war near Romania, in Ukraine, with Ukraine and the Russian, so the Europe will be hit and the Romanian will be the same.
Yes.
The economy will be the same.
Exactly. Now we don't have forecasts for a real invasion scenario, but I think where I put the emphasis is the weak link is the energy price and the inflation, because of course we saw how disruptive were the 2014 sanctions on Russia, and now we're talking about something even worse. So at that time, actually oil prices eventually fell. But what you could see at this time is that energy prices jump. And so that will be quite complex for Europe to navigate, which is why we fundamentally think this will have a diplomatic solution.
Okay, so you see the energy prices, if the Russian attack Ukraine, the energy prices will be up. So if the energy prices will be up, will affect the industry, all the products, all the services, and so on.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
This is your. It is not a scenario that will be a war, but in the case this will be the path. How the economy will react. Okay.
Exactly.
In this case, do you think the banks will increase the interest rates, or they prefer to put a stop, okay, and to see what will happen, and they inject money in the economies?
I think the local central bank, so the Central Bank of Romania's, their first mandate will be to make sure that financial stability is preserved. So I think supporting the bond market, reducing the pace of monetary tightening, I think that probably is their first reaction. The problem is that Europe and the US already have a lot of inflation in the pipeline. So my biggest concern is that the central banks will be in a very inconvenient position, because their mandate is to stop inflation. And therefore, I think you risk that you will have monetary tightening, maybe not as aggressively as we think, but you will have a monetary tightening that will significantly slow down growth for a while.
Okay.
The alternative,
Yes.
the alternative is that we have fiscal policies stepping in, just like we had it with COVID, and we have a lot of fiscal measures to try to offset the energy shock. And in that situation, growth slows down, monetary policy is on hold for a little bit, but the forecast that I've given you for interest rates may not happen in 2022, but they will eventually happen in 2023. What I'm essentially trying to tell you is that I think is misleading to think that we can be at this juncture and not eventually see a recession, even if short, because a recession is the only way central banks have right now to stop the inflation trend.
So you think that the recession, the economy to enter in the recession to stop the inflation?
Yes.
This is a strange thing.
It's a strange thing. It's the way we've always done it.
Nobody wants to talk about recession. How
That's
come
why-
will come? Look, if Mr. Isărescu come to the government and politicians say the only way to stop inflation is to enter into the recession.
He's not
will
going
kill
to say
him.
that, but
Yeah.
that is the essence. Look, I mean, you have a good example, an extreme example in Europe that we can look at. Look at Turkey.
Yes.
Okay, Turkey in the last 15 years has tried to eliminate recession and has tried to prioritize growth and employment over inflation. So the central bank consistently delivered inflation above their target and above the year before, essentially, and intervened very aggressively every time there was a slowdown. So the economy never went into the deflationary solution. And the outcome is, today, Turkish surveys show households no longer trust the lira. They don't know where to put their savings. Inflation expectations are runaway, and inflation now is genuinely on a hyperinflation path.
So for the Romanian, the smart way to think about the future is to take euro, to invest all their money in euro. This is the conclusion.
I think the conclusion for Romania is trust that in finance, occasionally recessions are not necessarily evil. It's a matter of life. It has to happen. What is more important is the long-term trajectory. And at this stage, as long as Romanian politics delivers more or less the reforms as it's pledged, and it invests the money of the state to support Romanian citizens, all of them, then I think actually investing in Romania is fine. Didn't I not just tell you that the stock market in Romania is looking up?
Yeah, it's looking up. Coming back to the bonds, the bond market, for 10 years, which is common. How you see the yield in Romanian? Right now it's over 5%, but in the case of the National Bank, will increase the interest rate to 4.5, and the inflation will be 7% this year. How you see the yield on the bonds?
Our models say that in those situations, the 10-year goes to 7.9.
7.9.
Yes.
Wow.
But
it
these
will
models,
be a disaster.
The models don't fully capture market dynamic. So my best recommendation would be that you don't see that much adjustment. Maybe you see 6, something less than that, because you have a captive market, and because from an international perspective, actually the 10-year is looking very attractive, actually. So you will have foreign buyers in that market. But from a modeling perspective, so what statistic tells you it has happened in the past, then 7.9 would be the fair value.
7.9. Wow. as I said, will be a disaster. Right now, the former prime minister and the former finance minister, the former economist from ING, said that Romanian takes money from investor of the higher interest rates, and he's complaining. How will you see the reaction for the market, for the Romanian? You mentioned that we have a pension fund that will be a buffer, okay, but foreign market, how they will see Romanian evolution?
I think from a foreigner's perspective, Romania is looking like a very compelling long-term story. The politics has been changing lately. Yes. More than usual, but not much differently from what we had seen it in the last decades. So I think Romania is still looking like a nice long-term partner and an attractive destination.
Okay.
I have seen the comments that you mentioned, and I think they are misplaced. Okay. Because Romania is not the UK, it's not Germany, it's not Italy. It has the future opportunities. But in terms of wealth, the economy is poorer than others, and therefore it requires a different risk premium.
Okay, so your projection for Romanian is that we'll have a good year, will not be war near our border, so will not be a war, but the inflation will be up. Okay, the interest rates will be up. The same interest rates will be up in United States and in Europe, and will stay with inflation for a long time, more than a decade.
Yes.
Okay, Raffaella, thank you very much for your intervention from London. See you soon. Ok? A fost Raffaella TENCONI, economist-șef la UD. UD este unul dintre cei mai importanți brokeri din Europa Centrală și de Est. Cam atât a fost de fel live de astăzi. Ne revedem mâine de la ora 12. O zi bună în continuare!
Știu ce spun.
Ce facem noi românii cu războiul care ne bate la ușă?
Săpăm un șanț la graniță și am scăpat de orice amenințare a Rusiei.
Ne preocupă mai tare greva STB-ului.
Ciucă!
Știu ce te interesează.
Ăsta e ciuca al nostru. Din 138 de pagini a ciordit numai 42.
Dacă apare discuția că ar fi plagiat, el pleacă.
E o tristețe. Noi întreținem sistemul. Știu cum să te fac curios.
Milionar din greșeală după ce și-a vândut 933 de selfie-uri sub formă de NFT.
A făcut 1 milion, este foarte șmecher. Voi îl subapreciați.
Știu cum să te emoționezi.
O dronă a provocat o explozie lângă aeroportul din Abu Dhabi. 3 persoane au murit, 6 au fost rănite.
Știu să conving. Meciul știu are reguli clare,
pe care abia aștept să-l încep. Știu să câștig.
A câștigat Hofi.
VAR contestă acest rezultat.
Știu, deci știi.